You started your career in more, as we all do, I suppose, in the mainstream role. You were reporting on the Bosnian War.
Yeah.
Like that. When did you start to feel that something in that mainstreamy world? Because talk TV is outside of that, I would say.
Well, it is, except it isn't, because it's still part of the news empire, you know. So it's part of the Murdoch empire. So it's kind of it occupies a space, I would say, outside of what you might call the mainstream kind of broadcasting media. But it's still very much part of you know, a large organization, you know. So we're not, I would never pretend that we're sort of like a pirate radio station or anything like that, because we're not. But I think it was around about the Brexit time, really, when we realized that there was something different about what we were doing, and something different about what people were saying to us than you would hear anywhere else. You know, you put the BBC on and there would be all these kind of stories about how great the European Union was and how safe it was for us to be part of it, and how we shouldn't leave it, and anybody who wants to leave it must be either a racist or an idiot or a bigot or somebody with low IQ. You know, it was around about that sort of time, around about sort of 2017, 2018. And then 2019 was the year that we kind of took off, because that was when we went down to College Green in Westminster and became part of the Westminster bubble. And nobody really wanted us there. And it was great. That was great, because you felt we had this tiny little tent that was kind of way at the back, you know, and looking over there, you could see this huge, you know, 2-story BBC colossus, you know, and similarly for Sky and ITV, they all had these really big studios with lights and stuff. At night you could see them. And we just sat sort of near the entrance, and we were just grand. We had these two very glamorous looking Spanish women working for us, who were sort of producers, and they used to just corral these politicians who would be just like, oh yeah, we'll come and talk to you. They didn't know who we were. And then they'd sit down and I'd sort of monster them. And it was great. It was so much fun. And I realized then that politicians really are not very smart. You know,
that's the thing.
Michael Heseltine called me impertinent.
Impertinent?
Yeah. I said, in order for me to be impertinent to you, I would have to think that you were superior to me. I said, which I don't. So I can't be impertinent. I'm sorry. It's the wrong use of the word. And he just looked at me, because people don't talk to them like that. You know, I just said, I'm not having it. You know?
Is there then a fakeness in that mainstream?
Totally, because a lot of the Westminster journalists in particular, you know, their lifeblood depends on favours from PRs and favours from, you know, the lobby, and making sure that they behave in a way which is not likely to upset anybody. And so, you know, I understand when I get some mainstream journalists on, and if it's hard for me to get them to call Keelstone a liar, because they know that they'll get punished by the Downing Street machine. And they won't get a question asked. And, you know, even same goes with Lindsay Hoyle. You know, Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House, you know, MPs are not allowed to slag him off. And I've had Reform MPs on the show. And I've said, you know, what about Lindsay Hoyle and all these free trips he keeps taking around the world, you know, where he's going to, you know, Nevis and you know, the Bahamas to talk about, you know, the importance of Parliament. I'm like, he's on a jolly, there's no question. And they don't want to slag him off, because if they do, they miss out on, you know, when Prime Minister's questions comes around, they don't get a question. They get punished by the system.
Are there times when you've watched journalists on TV and you've gone, this is just theatre? Yeah.
Well, during COVID, for a start, you know, people like Robert Peston, you know, the man who can't ask a question that takes less than 15 minutes, you know.
Yeah.
I remember once I was in the car, and in those days when we'd all be tuning into, you know, the press conference at 5 o'clock, and I remember getting in the car and I was driving, and he started his question. A friend of mine rang me, and I was on the phone for about 10 minutes, put the phone down. He was still asking the question. You know, he hadn't actually got to the end of it, you know, and he's so kind of, you know, I would say kind of, it's a vanity project for people like Peston. You know, he's trying to prove himself to be cleverer than the politicians. So he's trying to use long words. He's trying to kind of,
I hate that.
Yeah. And it's like, just ask the bloody question. Okay. Ordinary people need a bit of information, you know, don't just keep like Beth Rigby kept saying, you know, why have you not done this faster? And why have you not locked it down more quickly than this? Why are we, you know, people allowed to walk around? And we were going, hang on a minute. You know, we're asking, why are people not being allowed to walk around? Why are you not asking that? You know, and we weren't very often as an organisation in that press conference, because it was all very cosy, you know, and it would always start with the same 3 people. You know, it was Robert Peston, Beth Rigby, and whoever was the BBC political editor, I can't remember who it was. You know, and that was how they started every press conference every day. Boris Johnson standing there with Chris Whitty and his bloody graphs that were all to cock, and which were all, you know, fake in many ways, because they didn't start them where they should have started, and they started them sort of where it suited them, so that it looked a lot worse than it was, you know. All of that stuff. I mean, we've been talking about Nicola Sturgeon this week, because she's got a new book out. You know, horrendous times that we lived through, because these people thought that they were in charge of our lives, and people And we worked out quicker than most at Talk that this was all cobblers, you know? And, you know, what's the difference? You know, you can go into a pub and sit down at a table of 6, but you can't sit down at a table of 8. You know, you can have a Scotch egg and that means you're okay. You know, as long as you go in one side and buy a pint and walk out the other side and drink it over there, that's okay. You know, it was just rubbish.